everyone, it's Mrs. Gaines here, about to read chapter 6 of our class novel. I hope you're enjoying the book as much as I am. I think it's very sad and I'm very interested to find out what's going to happen next. So here we go. At first, Jim couldn't tell one boy from another. They all had the same sallow, thin faces and dark, sunken eyes, and they all wore the same scratchy clothes and caps. They had their hair cropped and combed in exactly the same way, except for the boy who had spoken to him in the yard. His hair had a wild way of its own. He found himself following this boy because he was the only one he could recognise. But it was a long time before he spoke to him. It was a long time before Jim felt like talking to anyone. He was numb and wrapped up inside himself. But it was one morning in the schoolroom that Tim spoke to him and became the nearest thing to a friend that Jim could ever hope for. The schoolroom, where the boys spent every morning, was a long, dim room with candles set in every other desk. The little window had been painted over so they couldn't look out. There was a fireplace and one end with sheets steaming around it. Old women sometimes wandered in to see to the sheets, putting the wet ones up and taking the dry ones to be packed off back to the big houses. These were the washerwomen, and this was their workhouse job, washing the clothes for the rich. The women would sit by the fire from time to time, mumbling to each other in low drones during the lessons, sometimes cackling out remarks to the boys or shouting out the wrong answers to the deaf old schoolmaster's questions. There were 4 big arches across the ceiling with letters on them, and Mr. Barrack would begin every day by pointing at the arches and then by asking one of the boys to read out the words. God is good. God is holy. God is just. God is love. The woman would chant out before the boys had chance, sometimes in the wrong order, just for fun, and they would nudge each other and screech with laughter. One morning, when it was Tip's turn to answer the question, he turned to the women and held out his hand for them to speak. They shook their heads and they pursed their lips, shaking with silent laughter, and Tip, taken by surprise, laughed out loud. Mr. Barrack shook him by the back of his jacket, half lifting him off the floor. "There's nothing to laugh at here," he shouted. "No, sir, there ain't," agreed Tip, and was given another shaking. The women loved this. For most of the rest of the morning, Mr. Barrack read out loud to the boys, pacing up and down as he did so the candle flames fluttered in his wake and the black shadow danced on the walls. Curled in his hand was the end of a knotted rope, which he swung as he walked, striking it across the desk from time to make the boys jump awake. Every now and then he stopped and he pointed at a boy who had to stand up and recite the sentence he just heard. If he got it wrong, Mr. Barrack swung the knotted end of the rope across the boy's hand. As a change from reading out loud, Mr. Barrack would shout out at one of the boys to fetch him his shabby old copy of Dr. Marvo's spelling primer. He would pounce on any boy. "Spell Chipley," he would shout, swinging his rope in readiness. One morning the boys were given chalks and slates to use. A visitor had brought them in as a present. They sat on the desk through the morning, and the boys all watched them lovingly, longing to have a go. "Now you can write," Mr. Barrack told them, at last easing himself onto the high stool of his desk and grunting with every effort. Tip put up his hand. "Please, sir, what should we write?" "Speak up! What should we write?" Tip roared. Mr. Barrack roared back. "What should you write? The Lord's Prayer, if you please." Jim risked a look around at the boys as they bent to their task, their breath smoking from them into the cold air. He put his elbows on the desk and his head in his hands. He was bleak inside himself, lonely and bewildered and afraid. Beside him, Tip squeaked his chalk across his slate, scratching out scrawly shapes. His tongue poked between his lips as he worked. He glanced sideways at Jim. "Why ain't you writing?" he whispered. "'Cause I can't," Jim whispered back. "I never knew how to write." "Cool, it's easy." Tip's eyebrows shot up and disappeared into the tangle of his hair. "Just wiggle your chalk across the slate like this." His chalk scraped and laboured. "There!" He leaned back in triumph and blew the chalk dust off his slate. He showed it to Jim. "That's good," Jim agreed. "What does it say?" Tip's amazed eyebrows shot up into his hair again. "I don't know. I can't read." Jim spluttered into his hands and Mr. Barrett jerked awake. He hobbled down the aisle towards Jim. "Did you laugh then?" Jim felt as if he had frozen into his seat. His lips stuck together as if ice had formed between them. "No, he didn't. It was me." Tip jumped up as the schoolmaster swung his rope in readiness and swished it down across the boy's outstretched hand. The women folding up the sheets by the fire cackled. The other boys sat in total silence while this was happening, staring straight in front of them, their arms folded. Mr. Barrett towered over Jim. "Why did he say you?" Jim forced himself to stand up, his legs trembling like reeds in the wind. "He said he can't read, sir," he whispered, and then had to shout it back a few times until Mr. Barrett could hear him. "Can't read?" the teacher bellowed. "Can't read?" "I'll say he can't read. What's the use of teaching boys like him to read? What do any of you want with reading or writing, miserable sinners that you are?" He pulled Tip's hand towards him again and lashed the rope across it. Jim glanced at Tip, afraid to speak. He could see that the boy's eyes were wet and that he was nursing his hand under his armpit. "Right," Mr. Barrett barked, and Jim picked up his chalk and scribbled furiously with it, just as Tip had done. At the end of that morning, Mr. Barrett told the boys to get out their instruments, and with the great shoving of desks and scuffle of their boots, they ran to the big cupboards at the end of the room, only to be shouted at, and they to go back and do it all again in silence. "I'd have to get hit anyway," Tip muttered to Jim under the noise. His eyes were still wet. "Did it hurt?" Jim asked him. Tip shook his head. "Once Barrack starts hitting you, Barrack always hits you," he said. He blew his hand and stuck it back underneath his armpit. "Every day, if he can. Just don't let him have the chance to start. Tell Barrack Tip did it. If he blames you for anything, Tip will get hit anyway, so you might as well." A drum was placed on the desk for them to share, and Tip stood up and reached out for a stick. At a wave of the schoolmaster's hand, the hymn tune started, such a thumping and wailing that the washerwomen ran out with their hands over their ears. It was like nothing Jim had ever heard before. Tip poked him with a drumstick and mouthed at him over the row to bang the other side of the drum with it. Jim just tapped it at first. He watched Tip to try and work out some kind of rhythm in the mess of the noise, and he saw that the boys seemed to be chanting something, the little black holes of their mouths opening and closing into a thunder of drums and whistles, while the candle flames flattened and danced like tiny white devils. "What you saying?" Jim shouted, as close to Tip's ear as he could get. Tip turned towards him. "I hate this place!" Jim could hear Tip's voice, faint and wailing over the beating of the drum. He had his eyes shut. He thumped and the drum in time to every word. "I hate this place. Bang, 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 bang. So do I," said Jim. "Bang, bang, bang." He closed his eyes and he put his head back. He shouted into the darkness, opening up his throat to let the tightness out. "I want Dad. I want Ma. Bang, bang, bang. I want Emily. Bang, bang, bang. I want Liz. Bang, 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 bang. I want to go home. Mr. Barrack raised his hand and the sound stopped, as if it had been torn away in shreds. Silence. Utter, swirling, hugging silence. Jim felt his thoughts tumbling into it and then settling into calm. He felt better. Okay, so why do you think Jim felt better? Do you think it was right that the teacher would walk along and use the rope on the children? And why do you think they were all screaming those things out? Okay, looking forward to the next chapter. Thank you for listening. Bye for now.